Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Fellow Feeling. This will be Part 4, Chapter 4, entitled Shock. The situation is only growing more and more dire. Shouta watches over Midoriya as he rests fitfully, breath shallow, heart kicking high and fast against the underside of his wrist. His skin is cool when he touches him, and he's only growing colder. He's so pale that he's practically translucent. Shouta has watched enough heroes die to recognize the creeping symptoms of hypovolemic shock. He looks up at the ceiling, straining his ears for any hint that someone is digging for them. They've probably been buried for over 2 hours by now, and they're quickly running out of time. Midoriya is already so cold and weak that he doesn't want to risk moving him through the maintenance tunnels, but if this goes on much longer, he's not going to have a choice. 10 minutes, he tells himself, taking silent count as Midoriya's heart pounds out a desperate rhythm. 10 more minutes, then we move. Footsteps echo hollowly across the room, disturbing his count. When he looks up, he sees that the scene hasn't changed in the hour or so since Midoriya had last fallen unconscious. Bakugou is pacing, back and forth over and over again, wearing a path in the concrete like he's trying to carve an escape route with his boots alone. He hasn't said a word since Midoriya had passed out, choosing to dedicate himself to pacing instead. At least his quirk-induced fear seems to be wearing off. The scant amount of venom he'd received must have worked its way harmlessly through his system. It's good news. It means that the venom isn't inherently toxic. But Bakugou is still afraid, judging by the almost manic way he paces back and forth, and that's just as terrifying, because it means that now his fear is completely his own. Sighing, Shouta turns his attention back on Midoriya. It seems that the more he learns about his problem children, the less he understands. He'd taken his students on this patrol in hopes of getting to the heart of their conflict. Now that he's gotten closer to figuring it out, he almost wishes he hadn't. Whatever he thought he might uncover, it wasn't anything as horrifying as this. He doesn't like getting involved in his students' personal lives is the thing. The only reason he'd stuck his nose in between Midoriya and Bakugou is because he'd perceived a very serious threat to both their own lives and the lives of those around them. And, well, he'd recognized the signs of trauma, and he'd wanted to help. He should have known that things weren't as straightforward as they appeared. Watching Bakugou comfort Midoriya, watching Midoriya cling to Bakugou like a lifeline, had proven that, at least. He'd always assumed that they hated each other, based on all their yelling and violent posturing. But now he wonders if he's entirely off base. Now he wonders if they're scared of each other, scared for each other, and struggling under the weight of a past he doesn't understand. "He was here," Midoriya had said, so terrified that he could barely breathe. "I heard him." "He's not here. If he tried to come near you again, I'd—" Midoriya had been scared of Shouta's voice, scared enough to attack him. And what had Midoriya called him after the quirk had taken effect? Shouta groans, dropping his head into his hands as if he can massage this situation out of existence. This is too much. He's unburied something here that he isn't sure he can handle alone. 5 more minutes. He looks up at the ceiling again. "Bakugou," he says, when the echoing thud of his student's shoes grows too much for him to bear. "Stop wearing a hole in the floor and come over here. I'll pass. You're not making anything better by wearing yourself out. You're hurt too, so sit." Bakugou curls his lip at him, baring his teeth. "I'll sit when I'm dead. How's Deku?" He's quiet for a long moment, considering what he should say, and that's what makes Bakugou finally stop pacing. "What?" he snaps, drawing to a halt. "Don't tell me he fucking died or something." There's fear in his voice, though, and it's not being induced by the quirk anymore. Shouta places a delicate hand on Midoriya's brow, wincing at the chill. "If help doesn't come very soon, we're going to have to risk going through the tunnels." "So he's getting worse." "It would be difficult for him to get better considering the conditions we're in." Bakugou swears under his breath, shuffling his feet like he intends to go back to pacing. But Shouta doesn't give him the chance. "Our best option would be for Ryuko to arrive with paramedics, but I haven't heard any sign of the rubble above us being shifted. And since my phone is lost somewhere in the middle of this mess, there's no way we can call for help." "Deku is still losing blood," is the tight response. Shouta spares Midoriya an anxious glance, eyes catching on the red stain that continues to bloom across the makeshift bandage. While the bleeding has slowed, it's still a considerable threat. Although Shouta had done his best to stop the bleeding, the wounds are so massive that not even the pressure of his capture weapon can stem the flow entirely. Every time he looks down at Midoriya, another portion of the silver fabric has darkened. He needs a hospital, Shouta says, as if Bakugou doesn't already know. We may have no choice but to take the tunnels. I wish one of us had a blood transfusion quirk or something. Bakugou finally sits, landing with a heavy thud. He looks so tired. This is fucked. We're fucked. Shouta doesn't necessarily disagree. There is a moment of bitter silence as Bakugou glares at his knees, silently chewing on whatever dark thoughts have been brewing since this disaster began. Until, in a moment of fierce clarity, all this happened because you wanted me and Deku to get along. Well, fuck you. Any other time, Shouta would reprimand him for cursing at a teacher. But in the moment, it feels appropriate. You should have stayed out of it, Bakugou bites out, and though he's shaking again, this time, it's not out of fear. You don't know anything about us. It's my responsibility as a teacher to step in when I feel that my students are in danger, he says, and while it's the truth, he knows that this particular situation isn't quite what he'd perceived it to be. In danger, Bakugou echoes bitterly. More danger than this? Shouta grits his teeth, trying to hold back his frustration. It was apparent to me that the relationship between you and Midoriya was unstable. I planned this patrol as a way to handle the problem, to make sure that you won't continue to threaten each other's lives, or the lives of others as you work towards becoming pro-heroes. Bakugou seems to sober slightly at that, though he still doesn't look particularly pleased. You could have just talked to us. Midoriya is terrified of teachers, and you aren't exactly. What? Bakugou barks out a laugh. He's not scared of teachers, is that what you thought? Shouta stares. He looks terrified whenever I call on him in class. When he gives me a wrong answer, he shakes. And just now, after he woke, he tried to attack me. Oh my god. Bakugou pulls at his hair, combusting with some mixture of embarrassment and anger. You really don't know anything. Then explain it to me. What? And do the guy that got us trapped down here a favor? No fucking way. Bakugou. You know what? I'll make you a deal. Get Deku out of here alive, and I'll tell you anything you want to know. It's the best deal he's going to get. He looks back down at Midoriya, and his stomach sinks when he realizes that he's grown even paler. His pulse is weaker than it had been a few minutes prior. There's still no sign that the rubble above them is being cleared. It's time, he says, making the decision that he's been putting off for far too long. We have to move him. All the breath whooshes out of Bakugou's lungs the instant the words register. He goes almost as pale as Deku as he asks, You're sure? He's going to die if we don't do something. It's harsh. He hadn't wanted to say it. But Bakugou needs to know the truth. I'm not telling you shit if Deku doesn't make it, Bakugou warns, but his voice is trembling. Shouta just shakes his head. I can't carry him with my broken arm. Do you think you can manage? We can't be sure how long this journey will be, but I wouldn't expect it to be longer than 20, maybe 30 minutes. Are the maintenance hatches really that far apart? I thought there was one on every corner. There is one on every corner, but with Midoriya in this condition, it's going to take them a lot longer to reach one. Bakugou doesn't wait for a response. Instead, he moves, crossing the room to reach his fallen classmate, and kneels beside him with a wince. His expression only grows that much more severe when he feels the coldness of Midoriya's skin, winding an arm beneath his shoulders in preparation to lift him. But of course, it's not that easy. Midoriya gasps, lurching back into consciousness as his wounds are jostled. He looks slightly more coherent this time, but his gaze is still distant, and shining when it finds the place where Shouta is kneeling beside him. Aizawa-sensei? He murmurs, which is good. Means that he recognizes him this time. Problem child, he greets, because the title had made Midoriya smile the first time he'd used it, all those weeks ago. It doesn't have the same effect now. Midoriya flinches, his body racked with violent shivering, and his fingers curl around nothing as he attempts to ground himself. The venom has yet to run its course, it seems, and it's only making things worse. Aside from the psychological strain, being in constant fear certainly isn't helping his heart circulate the paltry amount of blood that remains in his body. Bakugou shifts, jostling Midoriya where he lays, and he gives a pained hiss. You're fine. is the firm response, though Bakugo sounds far less confident than he had the first time he'd said it. We're taking you to get help. Midoriya chews his lower lip. Hurts, he whispers. Well, why am I so scared? You were hit with a fear quirk, Bakugo tells him for the second time, and the fact that he doesn't sound angry about repeating himself is just as terrifying as anything else they've been through today. Deep breaths, okay? Try to stay calm. Because the faster his heart beats, the more strain is placed upon it, and at any point it could just give out. Shouta has seen it before, and it's no less horrifying now than it had been back then. Midoriya whimpers as Bakugo sits him up more, and Shouta sees a bloom of fresh scarlet spread across the outer folds of his capture weapon. Not good. You okay? Bakugo asks roughly, which is an objectively ridiculous question. Midoriya gives a soft, stifled breath, choking on a groan as the pain sears through him. I'm dizzy, Kachan. Then close your eyes, idiot. We'll be... No, Shouta says sharply, daring to break in even though he's not sure how Midoriya will react to him. He'd recognized him at first, but will that change as the fear sets in? He can't go back to sleep. Midoriya, do you hear me? I know it hurts, but you have to stay awake from here on out. Bakugo looks at him like he's insane. It's better if he sleeps through the fear. I know it's better, but... He cuts himself off, shooting Midoriya a worried glance. He doesn't want to say this in front of him, but he doesn't have much of a choice if he wants Bakugo to understand. He's lost too much blood already, and we've just made the bleeding worse by moving him, if he falls asleep now. Bakugo stares at him for a moment, uncomprehending, but then his expression flickers with alarm and he issues Midoriya a very firm, "Scratch that. You're not going to close your eyes. Keep your eyes open and focus on me, understand?" All his command earns him is a tired blink. But I'm tired, Kachan. Shouta leans forward, bringing himself back into Midoriya's field of vision. Your teacher is ordering you to stay awake, Midoriya. You wouldn't want attention, would you? Or to be removed from your heroics class for the day. He jolts. No, Aizawa-sensei. I'll stay awake, I promise. But between his injuries and the immense energy he's expending, due to his body's natural fear response, it doesn't seem likely. Bakugo slips his other arm beneath Midoriya's knees, forcing them to bend. I'm going to lift you. It'll hurt, but stay with me, okay? It's almost gentle. You really don't know anything. Bakugo's voice echoes in his head. Bakugo stands, lifting Midoriya as carefully as he can, but it doesn't seem to matter. The pain must be blinding because the sound he makes is almost inhuman. Deku! Bakugo snaps once he's on his feet, after his classmate goes completely and terrifyingly limp in his hold. Hey, idiot! Wake up! For one long, distressing moment, there's no response. But then Shouta steps forward, tapping Midoriya's cheeks and coaxing him back to consciousness, and he reawakens with a dizzy gasp. A brief fainting spell, brought upon by pain and blood loss, most likely. Not exactly a good sign, but at least he's awake now. Bakugo gives a low hiss that falls somewhere between relief and fury. Stupid Deku, he snaps. I told you to stay awake. Sorry, it just hurt more than I was expecting. Bakugo bares his teeth, but he doesn't respond. Though he's putting on a brave face, Shouta can tell that he's struggling. He's exhausted after fighting the villain, surviving the collapse, and pacing for hours on end, and it shows in the way his arms tremble. Midoriya is heavy, all bulk and finely honed muscle, and he can't support any of his own weight. He's as good as a wet blanket. This isn't going to be easy. Let's go, Bakugo says, his voice tight. The sooner we get him to safety, the better, right? Right. Shouta leads them wordlessly to the hatch to the ground, left open after his previous investigation. Bakugo drops down first, helping Shouta lower Midoriya down once he is back on solid ground. And while the process is slow and painful, it's difficult to take a teenager's full weight with one good arm, and the movement makes Midoriya gasp. It doesn't take long for the three of them to exit into the tunnels that run beneath the city. It's damp and cold. Shouta had surmised as much earlier, but as he sees the way Midoriya's shivering goes from minor to violent, the gravity of the situation only hits him that much harder. Their time at the tunnels has to be as limited as possible if he's going to have even the slightest chance of survival. Grimly, they begin to travel. Their progress is maddeningly slow. The tunnels grow more and more freezing the further they walk, until all of them are shivering with each step. Or maybe it's just the moisture in the air that makes it feel colder, sinking into their skin and their clothing and attracting the chill. Either way, after a few minutes, Shouta is tucking his good hand under his arm in a fruitless bid to return a scrap of warmth to his fingers. More deadly than the cold, however, is the way that Midoriya keeps trying to drift off. It's an endless struggle to keep him conscious. They take shifts. Bakugou spends a few minutes jostling him every time he starts to close his eyes, and Shouta takes over when it becomes too much. Also concerning is the fact that as they continue to walk, he can see Bakugou's fatigue building. For as strong as he is, carrying well over 100 pounds of dead weight through the freezing cold is beginning to take its toll. The strain of the battle and the lingering aftershocks of the venom certainly aren't helping either. As he walks, shouldering all of Midoriya's weight, he begins to slump just slightly. They've barely been walking for 10 minutes before Shouta makes another difficult call. We have to take a break. Bakugou's head snaps up. What? Shouta understands his ferocity. It's not ideal, but it's a tactical move. If Bakugou exhausts himself completely, he won't be able to lift Midoriya at all. And if that happens, they'll be trapped down here in the cold with no way to move forward or back. But he has to word this carefully. He's learned by now that if Bakugou thinks he's being called weak, he'll outright refuse to listen to reason. It's another issue to work on, but now isn't the time. Midoriya could use a break from the pain, he says carefully, because he's beginning to suspect that the best way to get Bakugou to cooperate is to talk through Midoriya. And you could use a break from carrying him. We can't stop moving, is the response, gnarled through gritted teeth. Every minute matters, right? He can deal with the pain, and I can keep carrying him. But Midoriya gives a groan of protest, and Bakugou's expression flickers from furious to concerned in record time. Let Midoriya rest, Shouta orders, which is just a roundabout way of saying, let yourself rest. It'll only be a few minutes, you have my word. Bakugou glares at him like he wants to protest, but then he looks down at Midoriya, curled weakly against his chest, and his voice dies in his throat. He gives a short, pained nod, and despite all his posturing, he's quick to lower both himself and his classmate to the ground. Shouta is reluctant to sit down himself, irrationally worried that someone might sneak up on them while he's resting. But it's not as if he could put up much of a fight, even if someone unsavory did find them like this. Not with his capture weapon wrapped around Midoriya's stomach, and his arm dangling lifelessly at his side. So he allows himself to slide down the wall without much of a fight. He could use the rest, too. We're stopping? Comes a soft, pained voice, and Shouta winces at how weak it sounds. Bakugou gives a low hum. Not for long, nerd. Just keep your eyes open. A shaking breath. Then, okay, Kachan. Bakugou winces, probably detecting the same weakness that already has Shouta worried. He doesn't say anything, but the light isn't so dim that it hides the way he lays Midoriya's head on his thigh, gripping his shoulder almost manically. The minutes pass with painful slowness. Bakugou must be grateful for the break, but he doesn't show it. Instead, he holds Midoriya so tight that his knuckles turn white, glancing up and down the tunnel as if he's waiting for something to come flying out of nowhere to attack them. He's quiet for a long time, minutes even, his fingers pressed to his classmate's pale throat. When he speaks, it's just to say, his pulse is weak. We'll be out of these tunnels soon. Not if we just keep sitting here. Shouta says nothing. They'll have to start moving again soon, but not yet. Not until they've had another minute to breathe. The silence grows so thick that it's almost suffocating. Bakugou seems to be chewing on something, pressure building beneath his skin, but he doesn't say anything, not until... Hey, Aizawa-sensei. A pause, thick and hesitant. Something trickles behind the walls, light and fast like water. The sound grates against the damp air. Shouta waits patiently for whatever follows. I'll answer one of your questions. He blinks. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't that. Sorry. Bakugou sneers at him, but it's weak. You have questions, don't you? You wanted to know about us. Well, I'll answer one of your questions now, so choose wisely. For a moment, Shouta is confused, but then he realizes that this request isn't about him. It's about Bakugou. His student is trying to distract himself from this awful situation, and phrasing it like he's doing Shouta a favor is the only way he can muster the strength to speak. Midoriya isn't safe yet, he points out, as a means of making sure that Bakugou is certain this is something he wants to talk about. You don't have to tell me anything if you don't want to. But his caution just earns him a snarled, "Which is why you only get one question. Consider it a down payment. I'll answer the rest once he's safe." His suspicions are confirmed then. Bakugo is trying to find an excuse to release some of the tension he's been holding. He can't shoulder both Midoriya's weight and his own trauma. "Okay," Shouta relents. "Then I want you to tell me what you meant when you said that Midoriya wasn't afraid of teachers. What is he afraid of?" "That's asking me to spill his secrets," Bakugo mutters. "Well, fine. It's not like he'll care if he doesn't live." He winces. It's not a pleasant thought. Bakugo takes a deep breath, like he's steeling himself. "Deku isn't scared of teachers," he confirms. "Don't get me wrong, teachers haven't exactly been kind to him in the past. That's not really what he's worried about." Then, what is he worried about? Bakugo shoots him an uncomfortable look, like he's sizing him up, wondering if it's safe to tell him the truth. But he was the one that had wanted this, had wanted to talk about it, so it doesn't take too long to convince himself that Shouta can be trusted. "He's scared of people like you." He frowns. People like him. "Don't get me wrong, I'm sure the nerd knows it's irrational, but you're just abrasive, I guess." "Abrasive," he echoes, and sure, it's true. When he'd first taken this job, he'd suspected that his harsh edges were going to get him into trouble. Over the years, though, he's never once encountered a student that couldn't figure out that he cared about them, despite his unforgiving words. It's always just seemed like a given that he would die for his class. Does Midoriya not understand that, even after the USJ, even after the training camp? Midoriya goes up against dangerous villains on a monthly basis, Shouta points out, and he's not particularly afraid of them. Are you saying they're not abrasive too? "No," is the uncomfortable response. "They are." "Then why?" "God, will you remind him of someone, okay? He's not scared of teachers, and he's not scared of you. He's scared of that person." It's like being doused in cold water, hearing that sentence fall out of Bakugo's mouth, because just like that, the threads of suspicion that had been steadily weaving themselves together are pulled tight, snapping into a nauseating fragment of a larger, unknown picture. Midoriya's fear of failure, his anxiety, the way he flinches at every loud sound, every unexpected touch, the way he'd looked at Shouta, eyes glazed with delirium, and whispered, "Dad?" The fact that Shouta knows that Midoriya's father isn't listed on his school paperwork. Midoriya and Bakugo have known each other for a long time, haven't they? At least since middle school, probably longer. If something had happened in those years, something surrounding Midoriya's father, then Bakugo would know all about it. And if Bakugo had been involved somehow, that would explain the tension that exists between them to this day. He really, really doesn't want to be right. "Midoriya's father," he says, testing the waters, and Bakugo's response is all he needs. He freezes, locking up like the words have stolen away his ability to breathe. His fingers curl in Midoriya's hero costume as if trying to stop him from being taken away, and he hunches almost protectively over his classmate. It's a good thing that Midoriya is barely conscious. Ironically, if he heard Shota's words, he'd probably panic, especially with the venom still circulating in his system, and the last thing they need is to have to restrain him again. It takes a minute, but Bakugo eventually seems to realize that his fear is unfounded, and his fingers unfurl just slightly as he admits, "I can see the similarities." Shota's heart twists. Has he been such a poor teacher to Midoriya that he reminds him of an abusive father? How is it possible that he's failed him so completely without even realizing it? "You're not actually similar," Bakugo bites out as if picking up on Shota's dread. "You're not anything alike, not really. I'm just saying, I understand why Deku thinks the way he does. Singling him out on the first day, erasing his quirk, making all those comments about him being useless in a fight. Probably reminded him of back then. That man used to say things about him being useless too." Horror flashes through him. His policy has always been that of brutal honesty with his students, for their own safety more than anything else. Sometimes that honesty verges on insult, as it had when he'd warned Midoriya about being useless if all he could manage was a single punch. But for as harsh as he'd been, he'd never imagined that his words had been perceived like this. This whole time, Midoriya has been mistaking his brutal honesty for anger and disappointment, and now it's led to this. "You knew Midoriya's father," Shouta says, because There are still a few pieces of the puzzle out of place, and he needs to see the whole picture. No matter how horrifying it is, he feels that he owes it to Midoriya to understand. Bakugou gives a silent nod, and Shouta doesn't miss the way he curls in on himself, hand drifting to his torso as if to cover an invisible wound. I don't remember it very well. We were 5, I think. It? Shouta echoes. But it's a step too far. Bakugou bares his teeth at him, and Shouta realizes that he's pulled Midoriya closer and closer to him, clinging almost desperately. Whatever these kids have been through. Shouta leans back, rubbing a weary hand over his face. The picture is getting clearer and clearer now, all the pieces beginning to lock together. And he doesn't like what he sees. It seems fairly obvious that something serious had happened, involving not just Midoriya and his father, but Bakugou too. And that something had likely been violent. Whatever it is, it's likely the reason for the tension between them. What Shouta had perceived as aggression and hatred between the two was clearly just unresolved trauma from that event. They don't hate each other, but when they look at each other, all they can see is that singular shared moment in their past, and it's stopping them from ever being able to move past it. When they interact, they must see nothing but fear and trauma, and while Midoriya handles that fear by shaking and trembling and trying to escape, Bakugou handles it with fury. It's ironic that, just when Shouta is starting to get a handle on the truth of their situation, one of them might die. Feeling the urge to move, he pulls himself back to his feet, wincing at the pull on his muscles. If he feels this sore after such a short walk, he can't imagine how Bakugou must be feeling after carrying Midoriya. He'll give him just another moment of rest. I'm going to scout ahead, he tells Bakugou, who seems entirely unwilling to look at him. I'll be back soon, and then we'll continue. Bakugou says nothing. He gives a short nod, and that's it. Taking a slow, grounding breath, Shouta leaves his students behind, moving carefully down the tunnel. He doesn't plan on getting too far, just enough to see if there's a hatch within a reasonable distance. He makes it about 50 feet down the tunnel, keeping his students within eyesight as he scouts. He's pretty sure he sees a ladder in the distance, barely illuminated by the bare bulb that lines the wall, which is a good sign. Ladders lead to maintenance hatches, which lead to the surface, which leads to the medical attention they so desperately need. A tremor runs through the tunnel, making the walls rumble, and he pauses. That doesn't sound good. Is there a fight taking place on the surface, or has Ryuku finally started digging out the rubble? Another rumble, this one louder than the last, and then, in the stillness that follows, collapse. A massive boom sounds from the other end of the tunnel, the end they'd evacuated from, so loud that it makes Shota's ears ache, and as he turns back to where Bakugou and Midoriya are sitting, waiting for his return, he sees the walls begin to splinter. He has a split second to realize what's about to happen before the walls come down, raining rubble down around him, cutting him off from his students entirely. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 4 of Fellow Feeling. Chapter 5 will be up next. I am eager to hear your thoughts and reactions to this chapter as well, and as always, thank you so much for listening.